With Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about not only the misunderstanding of communism and fascism, how they came to be in existence, and the structure and nature of communist and fascist governments. And there's a bit of a variety in there. For example, the fascism that Mussolini perceived was rather different in many ways from the fascism that Hitler perceived, if indeed you could really call them fascism. So, and this, of course, contrasts again with the communist governments of the 20th century. Now, not only are people bewildered, well, how did it happen? Where did it come from? It just came out of nowhere, and suddenly, and that's simply not true. There were many forces at work that led the world, back in the day, to fascism and communism, and we need to discuss, and we'll do in this essay, discuss some of those forces that were critical and pivotal, that were absolutely necessary as preconditions for these sort of things to occur. Now, fascism was largely with the acquiescence of the people, and that's something that separates from communism. In modern communist terms, it was always imposed at the point of a gun, and this is very important to understand. So if you're looking for the bad guys of history, the ones that impose ideological government at the point of a gun, I think are always that little bit worse than people than governments that at least try and bring the people along with them. So let's look at fascism, just starting with that. Now, the fascist concept, so starting with Mussolini, who was into fascism in the 1920s. Now, the idea was that with fascism generally, was that the government and business, you can't sort of get the corner shop as a collaborator. It has to be the bigger businesses for obvious reasons, would collaborate for the greater good. What is the greater good? Well, it's to supply goods and services to the people, and to supply regular employment, and to ensure that the public services function, so that the roads are built and maintained, the trains and the transport systems run, and the buses come around when they're supposed to, and these sorts of things. So it's something that is ideological only in part, but it's if we work together for the betterment there. But there still was things like freedom of worship, freedom of association. There was freedom for factory managers or business owners to hire who they wanted. So the level and type of state control was more at the macro than the micro. Now, it didn't mean that at the micro level they weren't, say, creating youth organizations and those sorts of things. But that was very much the sort of thing that happened at the time. It was very much a reflection of the time, such as the Boy Scouts in Britain, for example, or in the West. And there were various other groups. In Britain, they had things like the Boy Scouts, the Boys Brigade, and all sorts of things like that to try and socialize boys into being patriotic and good citizens and I remember I was at something when I was in the Scouts or the Cubs, and the things that they taught you were good civic stuff, like if you see an older person struggling to cross the road or these sorts of things, then you should help them. If you saw an older person carrying their shopping and they were clearly struggling on a hot day or something, that you should offer to assist. These sorts of things. And if you saw someone in distress at the side of the road, very much a good Samaritan biblical type, saw someone in distress at the side of the road, that you would stop and try and help them, and these types of things. But it also went further, that if you saw an animal, a critter in the forest that had been injured in I don't know, a brush fire or something like that. You had some water, you should give it to the critter or try and help the critter get to a vet or something. They were very. It was. I thought it was very good civic stuff. I think that today, let alone at the time. I probably didn't think it was good civics at the time. It was just something that you did, and adults sort of said that's what you had to do. But today, when I have much more time to reflect, and I can look at government policies and social attitudes from 50 odd years ago, and I can say, that was a load of crap. But there are some that stand out as still being for the common good, the common weal, and again helping a senior citizen, which at the time I think I would have thought, given when I was 10 years old, I thought anyone over the age of 20 was ancient, but helping a senior citizen, cross the road, these sorts of things, that I still think that today. A few days ago, there was an old lady, not in good shape. She's going to cross the pedestrian crossing, and she was frightened and hesitating. Would a car run her down? And I came along and I said, look, I'm going to walk across. Do you want to walk with me? So I walked very slowly until she got across, this sort of thing. So even today, I still think those things are good things to do from just a pure, civic responsibilities and obligations thing. So the fascists were much more, not that the communists didn't tout that sort of stuff, but it was to create, conformity and spread terror and try and find a way of getting at people that may not have been on board with the ideology. The fascists had very few. Hitler had Mussolini had very few political. They had them, but the political prisoners were die-hard communist revolutionaries, not just people who disagreed or didn't agree fully enough. And there's a big difference there in that ideological structure. But how did fascism come about? And where did it come from? Well, Italy was in a state of complete disarray. There was lots of attempts at communists after World War One, at communist uprisings and unrest. Agitators trained by the Soviet Union were, that had recently become communist in 1917, were around. There was a general belief in the communist leagues, of which there were many, that the time for revolution was ripe. It was now. And so there was all sorts of industrial unrest. And some of the things that we saw in Germany little at the time and later, judges and public officials getting beaten up and slapped around in public by the communist goons, these sorts of things. There was a lot of disruption and unrest, and a lot of the industrial class, the business class, they were alarmed by this because they knew that their nice houses and their factories and their life's work and their business would all be stolen by the communists and appropriated by the state, as it had been in the Soviet Union, and was clearly in the communist manifestos that were running around at the time. The Socialist International was sprouting this sort of nonsense. So along came Mussolini and with the right sort of support, and he said, well, we'll put an end to all that nonsense. So they started, Mussolini wasn't elected in the same way that Hitler was, or appointed by the authorities. The king put Mussolini in as like the equivalent of prime minister, and a lot of the opposition political parties and infiltrated by communists. So Mussolini was putting people in prison. This is depicted today that he was just rando arresting people who didn't agree. That's bullshit. The people who were arrested were communist agitators, revolutionaries, and troublemakers in general, not people who disagreed with the state, but who believed communist revolution was a necessity and must happen, and they were going to force it to happen again at the point of a gun if necessary. So now the situation in Germany was a little bit different. I mean, similar in some ways, but the reality is that the peace imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, Germany had come within a whisker of winning that First World War, and it terrified the Western powers. So they thought which was very much the thinking back in the day, and saying, if we can somehow keep Germany weak and poor and all fucked up, then we'll never have to worry about being invaded or attacked, or having to meet the might of the German military machine and so on again. And so they did that. Very much an attitude you see today with the Jewish activists. If only we can destroy the Christian Gentiles, then we'll never have to worry about another Hitler coming along again. That mentality is very childish and silly, and just fails to grasp and come to grips with the situational circumstances of how fascism came to be. So that peace imposed on Germany was unnecessarily brutal, and achieved the only thing it achieved was to sow deep seeds of resentment. And I mean, what else would it do? Something like a peace imposed like that. And the communists, after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, and they had a civil war there. The communist, if you like, the constitution of the Soviet Union was to spread communist revolution all over the world, and they were obligated in their constitution to assist any communist revolutionaries anywhere in the world, offering material assistance, weapons, propaganda, agitators, and all sorts of things, which they did. And they thought Germany would be a key sort of the next domino, if you like, to fall. And a major industrial power like Germany in the centre of Europe becoming communist was viewed as a great prize by the communist agitators. So they were running around Germany trying to foment revolution, the Spartacist Revolution in 1919. And there were numerous other uprisings that the communists organised, each one thinking, this will be it, this will nail it. But it didn't. They just didn't get the traction. But they were doing the same things. They were communist street goons running around, intimidating public officials, beating them up, slapping judges around, engaging in all sorts of high-handed acts of intimidation. Shops that were viewed as non-communist, sympathetic, were boycotted. I mean, when the Nazis boycotted Jewish shops, that's outrageous, anti-Semitism, it's wicked, it's evil, it's Hitler. But when those communist goons were boycotting Christian shops, for example, in Germany, we don't hear about that. And we need to understand that both of those things happened. So Germany, Hitler was when Hitler was first started going around to community halls and so on, making speeches, he was lucky if anyone turned up. But he was starting to get traction by the mid-1920s. But his star was fading a little bit as the German economy picked up in the sort of 1926, 27. But then when the Wall Street crash came in 1929, everything went to shit, and the unemployment ranks of the unemployment were huge. The crippling payments Germany had to make because of the treaty were keeping it again poor, and German children were dying during the winter, and all these sorts of things. Again, deeply ingrained resentment. And Hitler, and of course, don't forget the communist uprisings, industrial unrest, and all sorts of things. Communist agitators running around, but the Nazis, the National Socialist Workers' Party, they were sort of put together, if you like, to fight the communist street goons. This is where the brown shirts and all that came from. They were sort of created to fight the communist attempts at uprising. And so they were running battles in the street because the government had lost control. In effect, it had lost confidence in itself, lost its ability to really control much. So Nazi and communist street goons would be running up and down the street, having street battles with knives and shootouts and baseball bats and whatever else, and they'd be running through shopping centres and into public parks. It was a rough time. The Nazis were seen as the people who were stopping the socialists, the communists, which nobody really wanted, given their tactics of slapping judges around in public and this sort of stuff. So when the Wall Street crash came and the German economy crashed sort of really along with it, then Hitler's star began to rise again. If the Wall Street crash hadn't come along, I doubt Hitler would have made it into government. Possible, but I would think unlikely. And the Allies had already realised that the Versailles Treaty wasn't really delivering what they thought, and they didn't want a weak Germany becoming communist, so they were already relaxing some of the conditions that they put on Germany in 1918, 1919. So things were potentially going to improve, but then the Wall Street crash came, as I mentioned, and that elevated the circumstances that would deliver. Now, the government was hopelessly ineffective. It had no employment or industrial policy. It sort of staggered and meandered around, not knowing what to do next. Governments were coming and going. They were coalition governments that lasted for 5 minutes and then collapsed. But bear in mind that democracy in this way was new in Germany. Also, because it had been a monarchy effectively before that. And the government had to have a 53% majority before it could form government, which isn't easy when you've got 20 parties vying for government. It means the vote is splintered, as it is in Germany today, by the way. The vote is splintered across so many parties. Now, so to quell the unrest and the industrial unrest, political unrest, social unrest, loss of control of the streets and this sort of thing, the Marshal Hindenburg, who was the president of Germany at the time, the World War I military hero, he was talking to Franz von Papen, the aristocrat who Hindenburg listened to, and von Papen said, "Look, this Hitler guy, he's got like 43% of the vote. They're the biggest party by far in the German parliament, the Reichstag. My party, whatever, I can't remember, von Papen's party had like 9% or something of the vote, 9 or 10%, somewhere around there. So he said, look, I'll go into coalition with this Hitler dude, and we'll be able to meet the 53% threshold, and we can form government. But don't worry, because von Hindenburg says that corporal, that nobody, that working class boy, because bear in mind the government was considered to be the business of aristocrats and upper class people, and Hitler was a lower middle class guy. In the army, he was a fucking corporal, for goodness sakes, and Hindenburg was a field marshal. I mean, he wouldn't piss on people like Hitler normally. But von Papen talks him into it and says, look, this guy, we'll quell the unrest and so on. But don't worry, Hitler will be chancellor. He's the biggest party, got even that. There'll be one other ministry, but all the other senior ministries will be filled by my people. So we can control this guy. Once we've got the streets under control again, then we can piss him off. But Hitler was way too much of a wily fox for them. But looking at the fascist government, other than the treatment of the Jews, homosexuals, communist revolutionaries, gypsies, other than that, the fascist government allowed for freedom of association, religion, business people could hire who they wanted to. The universities could teach, the schools could teach pretty much what they wanted, although they did have to have German history. German history had been watered down quite a bit during the Weimar time, but the Nazis wanted it beefed up again. Why not? But in government, because the Germans were sort of more or less broke, really, they couldn't get loans anywhere. So they began, and this is something that the Soviet communists did, they began using barter as a way, a corporate barter, so that, and I'll simplify this a bit, that the company that mined coal, for example, would say, well, we'll give you coal, but you have to give us steel and sandwiches in return. And the company that made this, okay, well, you give us the steel and we'll give you the sewing machines, and so they bartered between raw materials and finished product, and exchanging, if you like, bills of value between. So that allowed business to develop and prosper. And so in 1933, Germany was pretty much broke when Hitler came to government in January 33. By 1939, early 1939, Germany had the highest standard of living in Europe. So that was, what, 6 years? It took 6 years. Now, if the Nazis could do it that quickly, and that, with such substance, then clearly it was always possible. But they just were a bit innovative and applied more economic and practical ingenuity to the problem than others had. But that's how quickly they were able to pull it off. And, it's a pretty impressive feat. But this idea of capitalism had failed, that the Great Depression had said capitalism is a failure. Now, maybe a bit of tweaking or something can get it right, but it was seen as a failure. It was seen as not legitimate anymore as a form of government. Particularly given that in the Roaring '20s there'd been a massive overinvestment and exuberance in things, in the stock market and so on. And so when the things began to slow down, then the crash was inevitable, given how over-leveraged and over-geared everybody was. So, why did that happen? How did it happen? And when you've got unemployment rates of 25, 30% and 35% even, and amongst sort of the labouring class, if you will, who'd had, always had pretty good jobs, and certainly doing very well in the Roaring '20s, amongst the labouring class, the employment was 40, 50%. And if you read novels such as John Steinbeck's Mice of Mice and Men and so on, you get a feeling for just how difficult it was for those people who were in that labouring class. A lot of people still, a lot of the public servants, those still had jobs and they were still doing all right. And there was a view to cure the effects of depression. The books had to be balanced. Governments had to balance their budgets, which really rubbed a lot of salt into the already raw economic wounds of that depression, of the crash. But the Nazis treated it rather different, or the fascists treated it rather differently. And you can see in Hitler's speeches, his writings, on how concerned he is about the standard of living of the people, in stark contrast to folks running around today that scream, "You're a fascist, you're a Nazi." Maybe they should consider also about the standard of living of the people today, and that might cause them to back off a bit from some of the crazy policies that have rents and mortgages running at 4 to 5 times the rate of wage increases. So the Nazis today, were they harsh on the Jews and the homosexuals and the communists? Yeah, and that's well documented. There are some aspects of the fascism that are lessons for the future. Once the Nazis had declared that the Jews and the homosexuals, whatever, were sort of public enemies in effect, then they also in effect suspended their legal rights. And this is the bit that I have a lot of concerns with. The burden of proof required to drag a Jewish homosexual into court, for example, was very low. Whereas the burden of proof for that same Jewish homosexual to defend themselves in court was artificially high. This effectively, in reality, denies them due legal process because they're in effect deemed guilty as they walk in the. But how is that any different from accusing straight white males of being Nazis and fascists today? January 6th, it was an insurrection, and we're going to arbitrarily arrest you. White supremacy is the big danger today to the world. Those are lies, horrible, horrible lies that they're telling there. And yet the lessons, and they're mostly Jews that are promoting that today. Yet the lesson surely from 1930s Germany is that if you go, the idea of taking away people's legal rights and due legal process and artificially subverting the law in order to get at people just because you don't like them, rather than producing the evidence to convince a independent, impartial court that criminal acts occurred, and here's the evidence to prove it. This idea of subverting the legal system to get at people you don't like, or you've pre-declared, prejudicially pre-declared as public enemies. That's I think a terrible terrible thing. You look back on the fascist Nazi accomplishments in Germany, whether you want to look at the building of the autobahns or the high standard of living that the Nazis gave to Germany, that Hitler delivered on the promises he made. You still can't go around, in my view, it's still a bad look, terrible optics to go around subverting the legal system just to get at people because you don't like them. But that's happening today. This falsely declaring that white supremacy is the big danger. That's a lie. It's not happening. There's no such thing as white supremacy. What nonsense. So the key mistakes, I think, bad optics that the Nazis put in place, and the communists too. They did the same thing. Any ideological sort of government seems to, it seems to be an irresistible magnetic pull that they come and subvert the legal system. It happened then, and it's happening again today. But fascism and communism were responses to what was seen as the complete failure of other systems of government, and they weren't crazy ideas that came from nowhere. They were formed by and shaped by those forces that had determined quite reasonably. The Wall Street crash was a big deal. Had determined that capitalism just doesn't work. Otherwise, how is it delivering so much suffering to the people? So this is where it came from, and I think this more nuanced understanding of history and fascism and Nazis and Hitler and Mussolini. This needs to be kept in context. For being a Tacitus today, your Pushback Challenge. Thank you for listening.